Thank you for joining me. My name is Lisa Zucker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and certified Thanatologist with the Association for Death Education and Counseling. This update is meant to be a supplement for professionals who are providing services following the tragedy at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. The objectives for today are to move past the 5-stage model for grief, to supplement your working knowledge base, to promote awareness of current models of grief, to identify possible interventions to utilize in conjunction with current modalities that you are already implementing, and to know when complicated grief requires referral or collaboration with a specialist. There have been a lot of developments in the field of grief work since the 5 stages came into the mainstream in 1969, yet most providers' training begins and ends with the 5 stages. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself acknowledged that the 5 stages, which were based on research of people who were dying, not people who were bereaved, were never meant to be linear and were never meant to package grief into 5 neat, predictable stages. She said that grief is as unique as each individual. There's substantial evidence that the 5-stage theory of grief is harmful to people. I provided links to 3 articles, but there are countless resources identifying the harm and pushing the stages on grieving people. Rather than trying to identify and categorize people's mess of emotions during their grief, help them instead to grieve in a way that is authentic to themselves. Help them live alongside the loss, not make checklists of each stage and then graduate from it. The people affected by this tragedy are never reaching some theoretical place of acceptance or closure with their loss, and pushing them to do so would create more burden, stress, and guilt rather than coping, support, and movement through their grief process. This is why I thank you for allowing me to present alternatives to add to your professional toolkit. Other ways you can see their grief and know what to do with it as you assist them in the ways that you're trained to, whether you're a professional treating their trauma, their body, or their spirit. We are going to skip the 4 decades of research and progress in the grief therapy field and get right to the points that will help you to help them now. I highly encourage anyone who has an interest in ongoing grief interventions to dedicate time and continuing education to learning more about the development of the field of thanatology by visiting the Association of Death Education and Counseling website. As Dr. Kubler-Ross said, our grief is individual and unique because it is dependent on our past experiences, our coping skills, and our support network, in addition to other factors. That being said, we can identify general themes and concepts that may relate to the people you are working with, and you can apply those models to them or consider other models that fit their narrative more fully. We're going to begin with Dr. Ken Doka's work in grief styles identified as intuitive and instrumental. Intuitive grievers talk about their grief in terms of their emotions. Dr. Doka said, their expression of grief mirrors their inner experience of grief. Often people who are intuitive grievers process their grief by sharing with others and exploring their feelings through support groups, in therapy, talking with friends, or journaling. Instrumental grievers experience their grief in a more physical or cognitive way. The people on the far side of this spectrum are the ones who say they didn't cry as much as they thought they should have, or felt like they had been kicked in the stomach while thinking about what had happened over and over again. Instrumental grievers process their grief by doing. They are the ones who start walkathons, foundations, awareness, communication, and movements for change. This is not a deflection from or denial of their grief. This is their grief. These styles are on a continuum, one in which I believe people can fluctuate throughout their grief process, even within the course of a day. Others grieving beside us influence us with their own grief style as we support one another. When the MSD students who have started the Never Again movement were told to stop speaking out and allow themselves time to grieve, this was said by people who don't understand that activism is their grief and is how they will try to begin to make sense of such senseless loss of life. One last note about these grieving styles. Some theorize that the intuitive style is characteristic of women and the instrumental style is characteristic of men when they explore gender differences in grief processes. But Dr. Doka explained that this was to be understood in the Jungian sense of female versus male rather than specifically a gender difference. Margaret Strobe and Hank Schut developed a model of bereavement called the dual process model. I explain this to my patients as the roller coaster or waves of grief. People oscillate between loss-oriented and restoration-oriented coping. Basically, this means that they believe people go through a natural and normal cycle of going back and forth between dealing with the loss and avoiding the loss. This further means that when people say they can't believe what has happened, or that it doesn't feel real, or maybe their loved one will walk through the door and this was all just a bad dream, that there's nothing wrong with them. Our role is not to pressure them to get through their denial and face the truth, but rather to bear witness to their process at whatever pace is most effective for them to navigate between immersing and pulling back, while being mindful of alarming symptoms that require more intensive intervention. Dr. Alan Wolfelt described the mind's ability to stay within loss-oriented tasks for a period of time before requiring a break as a concept he called dosing. He acknowledges that feeling all of the grief at once is too much, so numbness or restorative coping or instrumental grieving gives us a necessary respite, and then the mind returns back to loss-oriented coping. What I often see with people are two ways they oscillate, either in a fluid shift between the two orientations of coping, or sometimes in a more sudden and drastic snap back into loss orientation that I call a grief attack. It has similar features to anxiety attacks in the suddenness, intensity, and acuteness of the experience. Sometimes there's a trigger for a grief attack, and sometimes it comes unexpectedly. Teach anxiety and stress reduction techniques to people so they have those skills to manage their grief attacks when they occur. Some people who have never experienced anxiety symptoms may not have those tools and skills readily available to them. Also, encourage people to always have an exit strategy. No matter where they are, they need a backup plan to be able to escape from a situation and go somewhere to either cry, call someone for help, or practice their stress reduction techniques. Knowing where a bathroom is, warning a host ahead of time that they may leave early, or having a set time for a friend to text and check in are exit strategies that can help. Acceptance, moving on, closure, and going back to normal are ideas best left in the past. Anyone who has lost someone to whom they held a close attachment knows that these attachments, though they will change, are never severed and gone, but instead maintained in new ways. I want to take a moment to read an excerpt from the HuffPost article written by Marjory Stoneman Douglas freshman Alexis Tractor. She said, "Before the shooting, I was not unfamiliar with death. My mother passed away from cancer. I attended her funeral when I was 7, and now I attended my friends' funerals when I am 15. But just because I've dealt with death before doesn't make the new pain any easier. Because I've seen death before, I know that it never really leaves you. The ones you lost are always in the back of your mind, and sometimes you'll see something that reminds you of them, and you'll suddenly break down. It could be years from now, and I could be crying. It could be at my high school graduation, and I'll be crying. I could be at work and crying. I could be in class a week from now and crying." In grief therapy, we don't seek to help people disconnect and compartmentalize the person or people who died. We assist people in reinforcing their bonds and finding new ways of maintaining that connection in so many different ways, from wearing their favorite color to starting a fund in their name, to holding space to cry and grieve, and so much more in between. You can read about the concept of continuing bonds in the book Continuing Bonds, New Understandings of Grief by Dennis Klass, Phyllis Silverman, and Stephen Nickman. When someone you love dies, your world shifts. The grief process moves us towards understanding a new life for ourselves, where we continue to connect with them, but in new ways and in a changed world from where we began before their death. This is magnified in the Douglas tragedy because not only are the people you are helping existing within a reframed version of their world, but so are you, and so am I. Be mindful of their need to emphasize the bond they share with the students and teachers they are grieving and focus on ways to help them connect to them. This is an important time to mention that cliches that imply closure, such as "they're in a better place," are extremely unhelpful to most people. Let's talk about some different types of grief. Most of you will encounter people experiencing disenfranchised grief, possibly including yourself or your own family or friends as a result of this tragedy. Disenfranchised grief is grief that is not societally viewed as permissible or is minimized by the world around you. An example of this is a person who acknowledges that everyone around her is of course impacted by the devastation of this tragedy, but for some reason there was one life lost that struck her more than she felt she could have anticipated. This was not someone she knew, but she felt she was grieving as though it had been. Another example is someone who had a negative relationship with one of the people who died. Others ask, "Why are you so inconsolable when you weren't even friends?" But the guilt and remorse for that person influences the grief they experience in this situation. So what do we do with this disenfranchised grief? We remind people that their feelings are valid, that they deserve safe space to grieve their loss with someone to listen who won't judge them. We encourage ritual because if the grieving person did not and would not have attended a funeral because of the societal implications or judgment or out of respect for the family, then create their own ritual and honor them because we as human beings heal within ritual. Tomorrow's Rainbow in Coconut Creek is holding safe space to allow people to gather and are hosting candle lighting nightly from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Complicated grief is a term that is used to describe grief that falls outside of the typical parameters of what we would consider normal grief processes. It's a term that challenges me because I think all grief is complicated in a sense, but we need ways to describe situations that may be more alarming, so complicated grief it is. Chronic grief is grief that produces feelings of hopelessness, apathy, loss of meaning or purpose in life, intrusive thoughts that continue for an extended period of time without any reduction in intensity, and distress among other symptoms. If someone exhibits symptoms of chronic grief, it must be treated seriously because chronic grief can lead to severe clinical depression, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, or other severe negative coping patterns and self-destructive behavior. Chronic grief is more likely in people who have lost someone suddenly or violently, so please pay special attention and seek supervision, collaboration, or possibly a referral to a grief specialist if you feel the person you are helping has symptoms outside the scope of your practice. Delayed grief is seen in people who consistently suppress their grief by distracting themselves or trying to be strong for others around them. This happens when a person doesn't oscillate towards loss-oriented coping and only works towards restorative coping. But grief can only be suppressed or postponed for so long before it rises to the surface on its own. This is not to be confused with instrumental grief. Delayed grief is when grief is entirely postponed or ignored and then floods back at a later time. Instrumental grievers who are doing things as part of their grief process also access loss-oriented coping in conjunction with restorative coping. Exaggerated grief is when someone experiences excessive depression, excessive anxiety, or another typical grief behavior manifested in an exaggerated way, so that the person is not able to properly function, and a psychiatric disorder diagnosis may apply. People experiencing exaggerated grief may develop phobias, self-destructive behaviors, or the development or emergence of a psychiatric disorder. Masked grief is when grief-related symptoms that people don't identify as being a part of their grief process emerge, such as negative coping or physical symptoms. Traumatic grief is when someone has the combined effects of the grief process and are also experiencing traumatic stress. Most of the people we're working with from this tragedy are experiencing traumatic grief, which is why we're doing this training together. I'm so thankful that there are so many wonderful providers in our community who are trained in trauma work and able to provide supportive services for the traumatic stress people are experiencing. I'm hopeful that this supplemental knowledge assists specifically in helping you to help the people you're working with who have experienced traumatic grief. People who experience traumatic grief may feel that their assumptions about the world or themselves or their faith have been shattered. They may feel abandoned and angry because of this. Often people who have experienced traumatic grief will ruminate about the death, the burial, the unanswerable whys, the fear of did they suffer, the inability to understand what purpose this tragedy could possibly have had in the world. When the question of why is asked, the response is often guilt or self-blame. How could I have prevented this? What if I'd done something different? These questions are fair and important to process, but they're also dangerous because they can be the source of persistent depression and anxiety. Collective grief is the grief we are currently experiencing as a community and as a nation. There are two models of the grief process I want to highlight: Dr. Worden's tasks of mourning and Dr. Rando's 6 R's. So first, Dr. William Worden developed the 4 tasks of mourning as a way of understanding the process of grief and how a person reestablishes equilibrium. He has emphasized that these tasks are not set in any particular order and that people revisit tasks throughout time. The development of the 4 tasks also demonstrates that grief is a process you do rather than just something that happens to you, which is empowering within such a painful process. Task 1 is accepting the reality of the loss. This doesn't mean being okay with it or how it happened. Instead, it's accepting that the person is physically no longer living in this world. Task 2 is processing the pain of the grief. We call the darker emotions like sadness, anger, guilt, and fear the dragon. So Dr. Ben Wolfe presented information at an ADEC conference I attended about befriending the dragon rather than trying to fight it, that when we acknowledge the dark emotions and process through them, we find control in managing them. But when we deny them or fight against them, ultimately, they maintain control over us. Task 3 is adjusting to a new world and adapting to a new life within that new world. Task 4 is finding enduring connection through continuing bonds and establishing new connections, beginning to engage in meaningful aspects of life once again. Dr. Therese Rando's 6 R's take place within 3 phases of the mourning process that she calls the avoidance phase, the confrontation phase, and the accommodation phase. The first R is recognizing the loss. This is when someone acknowledges the death as a part of working through the avoidance phase. The second R is reacting to the loss. During the confrontation phase, reacting involves the emotions, feelings, pain, and expression of grief. It's that dragon again of emotions. 3 is remember. Also during the confrontation phase, people recollect memories and feelings while reviewing the relationship with the person who died. The 4th R is relinquishing old attachments to the person, but also to the world as they understood it before the death by acknowledging that their perspective has been altered. This is also during the confrontation phase. 5th is readjusting to the new world by remembering and honoring the attachment to the person who died, and by developing new ways to connect. This is the process of establishing continuing bonds. Also during this part of the accommodation phase, new identity is established. So for example, a person who has lost a spouse is now adjusting to their new identity of being a widow. A teen who lost a friend in the shooting is now adjusting to being a teen who knows how short life can be by establishing the identity as a young person marked by early grief experience, or how important their voice becomes by establishing an identity as an activist. Secondary losses and shifts in identity may be grieved at different rates than the primary loss of the person. All of the losses combined create what we call bereavement overload. The 6th R is reinvesting in the world, and it's the final part of the accommodation phase. Any conversation about death, dying, or grief will inevitably conclude a dialogue about spirituality and culture. What happens when someone dies? Are they still around me? Do you believe that what just happened to me was a sign from them? You don't have to have all the answers. A basic understanding of religious, non-religious, spiritual, and cultural practices and ideologies is beneficial, but most important is the ability to be comfortable with the conversation and comfortable with silence as the person explores their own ideas. In the grief process, we are merely companions to the grief journey, invited to walk beside people who are grieving, validating them with information that we have, and guiding them if that's what would benefit them. We're not meant to dictate or to tell anyone what they should or should not do in their grief. There is no right way to do grief. It's a mess, and a unique and individual one at that. Dr. Robert Nehmeyer has a substantial amount of research on the benefits of narrative approaches to grief work. Please consider researching these interventions more if they fit within the framework of your practice. In instances of violent and highly publicized death, the person and their life sometimes gets lost behind the story of the way that they died. Families and friends benefit from being encouraged to remember the life of the person, to use narrative tools to emphasize the significance and importance of their life as being equivalent, if not greater, than the recollection of how they died. This can be done parallel to trauma work, or may begin or continue on after trauma reduction has been implemented. This is Dr. Nehmeyer's template for creating a life imprint for you to consider using in practice with the people you are helping. For some of you, this may be a journaling exercise, written or otherwise narrative exploration with the person, and for others, just the reminder to ask questions about who their person was beyond the trauma, beyond the violence, and beyond the death that they are now processing. This promotes restoration-oriented coping as well as honoring the person who died. Expressive interventions are extremely helpful in the work of helping people who are grieving. If these are already modalities that you implement in practice, we encourage you to do them within the construct of grief therapy. Connecting is how we promote continuing bonds, which research shows allows for the greatest degree of adaptation following a loss. Linking objects are things that belong to the person who died, or things that represent a connection to the person who died. I've seen dancers wearing orange ribbons to honor Jamie, runners tagging Run with Coach Beagle, soccer players, band members, military, swimmers, and so many more finding objects, words, or items to identify their support and honor for the students and teachers who died. Rituals ranging from the funerals over the past week to community gatherings have helped people come together to support one another and should be encouraged to continue. Finding moments to be in nature, whether by going to the beach or by taking a walk at Pine Trail Park, is so important. The intensity of the chaos of media coverage and the trauma and pain of this tragedy can be tempered by being in a natural environment. Holding gatherings, rituals, therapy, meetups, and other sessions outside can be really beneficial for the people you are helping. Thank you so much to every one of you who has offered your time, your services, and your love to the community of Parkland. I'm honored to be a part of this network of providers, and I'm grateful you took the time to learn more about grief work. I want to thank Melissa Kornhaus for all of her hard work connecting and mobilizing professionals to support the community. Please send me your questions to grieftraining@gmail.com. If you're watching this live, you will get an email link for the Q&A session. And if you're watching this as a replay, please put your email in the registration link to receive the update on the Q&A session. Thank you again for joining me.